And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you love what we're doing and want even more content, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, and get exclusive access to 2 additional podcast series. And I do want to give a shout out to one of our longtime patrons who has supported us from the very beginning and was the first, actually, to support us on Patreon at the family level. Very grateful to Roseanne Martino for being there for us and helping us continue to bring you as much of this content as possible. So much appreciated, Roseanne. And today, we continue our journey up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1963. On 5 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 6, From Russia with Love, This Sporting Life, a documentary called Crisis Behind a Presidential Commitment, The Great Escape, and The Organizer. And today, we move on to number 5. So without further ado, the Best of 63 at the Movies Part 6, right now. And coming in 5th on my list for 63 is The Birds, Alfred Hitchcock's eagerly anticipated follow-up to Psycho, which had been a surprise international hit in 1960. That film, which cost a mere $800,000 to produce, earned a box office gross of $32 million, second highest grossing film that year behind Spartacus. Now, The Birds, with a somewhat larger budget of $3.3 million, was a far more elaborate film to produce than its black and white predecessor, with 412 complex optical effect shots, one of which, the last shot of the film, required the painstaking blending of 7 layers of images. And now, layered shots like that and the special effects would all be done digitally, of course, but the world of the early 60s was still very much analog. And so post-production on The Birds took substantially longer than Hitchcock had anticipated. So despite the fact that shooting wrapped on July 10th, 1962, the original plan had been to release the film on Thanksgiving of that year, it didn't actually premiere until March 28th, 1963, when it debuted as part of a retrospective of Hitchcock's entire career at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City. This was a period, the early 60s, when Hitchcock's image was rapidly shifting from that of a master craftsman to that of an artist. To me, he falls somewhere in between, as his films, while very artfully done, place a high premium on audience manipulation. If you watch the interview he did with Dick Cavett in 1972, it's on YouTube. It's really all he talks about, tricks of the trade he used to make the viewer feel a certain way, which is an interesting avocation and profitable if done well, and he was one of the best at it, but not necessarily the avocation of an artist. People like Ingmar Bergman or Akira Kurosawa, at their best, I think directors like that aim higher than mere manipulation. Although it's worth noting that those 2 men did not work in Hollywood, where the commercial pressure is incredibly intense, and Hitchcock did. But the French New Wave directors of the 60s, many of whom had previously been film critics, had a lot to do with this elevation of Hitchcock in the 60s, especially Francois Truffaut, who, in the summer of '62, traveled to Hollywood, where Hitchcock, even though he was deeply immersed in post-production on The Birds, made time for the young French director. And the 2 men sat down for a series of lengthy interview sessions, made longer by the fact that they required a translator. But these interviews became a book by Truffaut, published in 1966, highly recommended. And then some of the younger American critics followed in Truffaut's footsteps. Peter Bogdanovich, who was not yet a director in the early 60s, still a critic, he wrote a long essay on Hitchcock for that museum retrospective that I mentioned. And by the way, I did my own Hitchcock retrospective over the past few months. And at the end of today's podcast, I will give you very quickly my personal ranked top 10 list of Hitchcock's films out of the 50 plus that he directed over the course of his long career. Now, there are several themes or obsessions, really, that run throughout Hitchcock's work. And one of them is a very common, virtually universal fear, the fear of loss of control. And very often in his films, this loss of control stems from a false accusation. From the 39 Steps to Saboteur, to Strangers on a Train, to The Wrong Man, to North by Northwest. The rather mundane lives of the protagonists in all those films are completely upended by false murder charges. So there is a kind of Kafkaesque quality to much of his work. But one of the interesting things about The Birds is that this loss of control is expanded out. It's not just the protagonist, played by Tippi Hedren in her film debut, who loses control, but an entire community, and really, by extension, the entire human race. But here, the loss of control derives not from a false accusation, but from a disaster. From the human perspective, at least, a disaster which defies the laws of nature. Birds of every kind, every subspecies, have united to make war on the masters of the world, Homo sapiens. And one critical and I think excellent decision by Hitchcock and his screenwriter, Evan Hunter, whose real name was Salvatore Lombino, very prolific writer who used several pen names, most famously Ed McBain, which he used for his popular series of police procedural novels about the fictional 87th Precinct. But Hitchcock and Lombino/Hunter decided that no explanation would be provided for these escalating bird attacks. The convention in 1950s sci-fi disaster films was to blame the disaster on something. Nuclear radioactivity, or a scientific experiment gone awry, or some evil plot. But Hitchcock said, no, we're not doing that. And they don't hide from that decision either. I counted at least 4 or 5 times where a character in the film asks in so many words, why are the birds doing this? And no one ever has an answer for this abrupt reversal of fortune. And this lack of an answer actually serves to heighten the dread. In the face of grave difficulties, we like answers. Quick answers, any answers, even if evidence or substantiation is completely lacking. It's one of the reasons why conspiracy theories are so common in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, like a military invasion or an assassination or a terrorist attack. The conspiracy theory, however ludicrous, provides the illusion of control over a situation that is out of control. And Hitchcock also heightens the dread in this film with another risky, but I think correct decision. There is no musical soundtrack to speak of. There's a brief scene where Tippi Hedren plays a Debussy composition on the piano, and there's another longer scene where some school children sing a repetitive song just before they're attacked by the birds. But that's it, really, as far as music. The only other sounds we hear are natural ambience and the sounds that the human characters or their machines make, and then, of course, bird sounds, which were apparently augmented by some kind of electronic treatment. But whatever they did, it's not that noticeable. It just sounds like they added some sort of echo effect to the cries of the birds. But that had to have been a tough decision for Hitchcock, since the composer he'd used on his last 6 films dating back to 1955 was Bernard Herrmann, a genius who had just delivered 3 all-time masterpiece film scores in a row for Hitchcock on Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho. So to cast him aside, it's a little like benching your perfectly healthy all-pro fullback in the Super Bowl. But that was Hitchcock's decision. Now, there are a couple of scenes that could have benefited from music. One in particular, I would say, where the Jessica Tandy character, Lydia Brenner, just after the first major bird attack at her home, where she, her son Mitch, played by Rod Taylor, her younger daughter, and Tippi Hedren had been attacked by birds that flew in through the chimney. So Tandy drives her truck to the house of a farmer friend who doesn't answer the door. And as she slowly makes her way into the house, she notices a fair amount of destruction. And then finally, she discovers the farmer's murdered corpse. Birds have gouged out his eyes. So there, certainly, Herman could have heightened the suspense with music as she walks into that house. But on the other hand, to experience it without music is to experience it in the way we actually would. True life has no soundtrack, unless you're wearing earbuds. And so it does feel less like a movie and more like real life, which is scary in its own way. And by the way, just to point out one of a virtually infinite number of tricks that Hitchcock employed to heighten the impact of various moments in this film. When Tandy arrives at the farmer's house, the mood is relatively peaceful. So Hitchcock had the road leading up to the house somewhat dampened to mute the sound of her truck as it pulls up. But after she makes her shocking discovery and comes stumbling out of the house and back into her truck, Hitchcock almost immediately cuts to a super wide shot. And to accentuate her distress even beyond Tandy's excellent acting, which, along with that of Suzanne Pleshette, who plays the doomed schoolteacher, I would say Tandy's performance is the best in the film. But for her departure from the farmhouse, Hitchcock added a great deal of dust to the road and also had smoke put in the truck's exhaust. So in that wide shot as she races home, driving from screen right to left, she leaves this trail of smoke and dust, which was not the case when she arrived, and it kind of helps maintain the intensity. And it's not the kind of thing you would necessarily notice consciously, but touches like that to the soundtrack and the image do have an impact. And many of Hitchcock's countless tricks like that are revealed in the Truffaut book. And for this film, in Camille Paglia's excellent short book she did for the British Film Institute called The Birds. Now, one common thread between The Birds and Psycho, on top of the fact that both films upped the ante considerably in terms of gruesomeness, as Paglia points out in her book, with scenes like the vicious face stabbing of Martin Balsam in Psycho and the eye gouging of the farmer here, Hitchcock almost seems to have anticipated the highly publicized brutal murders and assassinations of the 60s with their fatal head wounds. But another common factor in both films is that Hitchcock delays the violence for a considerable period of time. The first 30 to 40 minutes of both films are really massive diversions or deceptions. The first act of Psycho is not about a psycho at all. It's about an extramarital affair between Janet Leigh and John Gavin, and then an office theft of $40,000 by Leigh. At least that's the plot until that butcher knife shows up and scrambles everything. But the murder of Leigh has nothing to do with the office theft. The murderer never even knew that she had all that cash. Now, the first act of The Birds is even more out of sync with the actual subject matter. The opening of the film plays almost like one of those Doris Day, Rock Hudson romantic comedies that were so popular then, where this beautiful, wealthy woman with a fondness for practical jokes meets a handsome lawyer, Rod Taylor, in a San Francisco pet shop. And after an extended, mutually deceptive exchange that's half flirty, half hostile, she finds out his home address in Bodega Bay and decides to go there and plant some lovebirds in his house, along with a clever note as a kind of a gag. Now, in Psycho, despite the unrelated opening plot, both the title of the film and Bernard Herrmann's super sinister music are warning you all along that something is coming, something far worse than Janet Leigh getting arrested. Now here, as I said, there's no music, and the title is more generic. So Hitchcock's foreshadowing technique to keep us on the edge of our seats is to end a number of early scenes by having Tippi Hedren and others notice these masked birds, or birds behaving strangely, which of course they misinterpret. For example, when Tippi Hedren rents a room for the night in Suzanne Plechette's house in Bodega Bay, a conversation between the two women about Rod Taylor, who the Plechette character had previously dated, is interrupted by a loud thud outside the front door, into which, they discover, a kamikaze seagull has smashed itself to death. Plachette says the bird must have lost its way in the dark, but Hedren points out that there's a full moon. So these disquieting tags at the ends of various scenes gradually and effectively accumulate until the first major attack on a children's birthday party. And then each successive attack causes greater damage. Rod Taylor's house is invaded twice. There's the eye gouging of the farmer. Then the most famous set piece, a beautifully orchestrated assault on the school, which is preceded by Tippi Hedren sitting on a bench outside smoking a cigarette, oblivious to the fact that dozens of crows are massing behind her, preparing to attack. And then there's another major attack outside a restaurant, where in a role reversal, Tippi Hedren, who earlier had blithely carried her two little lovebirds in a cage to be used as props in a practical joke, she herself is now caged in a phone booth as the birds try to get in and kill her. So the joke is on her. And then, after the attack at the restaurant, Plachette is murdered by birds, and as Camille Paglia points out, the way her dead body is positioned on the ground in front of her house, with her legs splayed out at odd angles, it's almost suggestive of rape. And then finally comes the vicious assault on Hedren when she gets trapped in the attic of Rod Taylor's house, which also has the feel of a gang rape. The shooting of that scene, by the way, landed Tippi Hedren in a hospital with what was described as nervous exhaustion. The shooting took not hours but days. Real birds were used, many of them panicked at being trapped in that small room, and when one of them got very close to pecking her in the eye, Hedren finally lost it. She broke down. And there's a very unusual shot after that assault, where Hitchcock breaks another rule. Hedren is finally rescued from the attic by Rod Taylor, who carries her downstairs. Which, by the way, in the film, as he's carrying her, you'll notice that you do not see Tippi Hedren's face. That's because the woman that Rod Taylor is carrying there is not Tippi Hedren, who was still recovering in the hospital. So they used a body double. But it is Hedren that Taylor gently places on a couch. And this character is so traumatized that she sees Taylor as just another attacking bird and starts flailing her arms, trying to fight him off. And the rule that Hitchcock breaks here is that Tippi Hedren looks directly into the camera lens, which is traditionally avoided by directors, as it breaks the spell of the illusion. Now, it's just for a brief moment, but that direct gaze of this traumatized woman places you, the viewer, in the role of almost a guilty party. You feel kind of implicated, as if this woman, as she's flailing her arms, is defending herself not from the birds or from the imaginary bird, Taylor, but from you, the voyeur, who just sat there observing this extended attack for your personal enjoyment. Now, another possible interpretation is that when she's looking through the lens, she's looking at Hitchcock with much the same intention. But either way, it's a strange and fascinating moment in a film chock full of them. Now, one last point before I get to my top 10 list. More of a question, actually, since I haven't really decided on the answer. I wondered, watching this film again, to what degree it is an expression of Hitchcock's misanthropy. In earlier films of his, you certainly have individual characters express misanthropic views, contempt for humanity. The young thrill killers in Rope, for example, or the serial killer played by Joseph Cotten in Shadow of a Doubt, who tells his adoring young niece, quote, "Did you know the world is a foul sty? Did you know if you rip off the fronts of houses, you'd find swine? The world's a hell. What does it matter what happens in it?" Unquote. So pure nihilism from this psychopathic character, but it's not the point of view of the film, necessarily. It's the point of view of that character. The niece, played by Teresa Wright, is really the hero of the film, and she ends up helping the authorities apprehend her uncle. But in The Birds, released 20 years later, the characters, while not evil, are pretty much universally wicked, self-involved, manipulative, narcissistic. So I found myself almost rooting for the birds, you know? And so I wonder if on some level that was the intention. Federico Fellini, the great Italian director, called this film an apocalyptic poem, which I think is a great description. But at times, you do get the feeling that the filmmaker thinks the apocalypse may be justified. And it's not just because of the sins that I mentioned of the characters. A fairly big deal is made about how birds, at least the ones we can corral, are either controlled or consumed by us without a second thought. The lovebirds in the opening scene, as I said, are used disrespectfully by Tippi Hedren as props in a joke, and the lovebirds were an impulse buy. She was actually at the pet store to pick up a pair of mynah birds as a gift for her aunt, which had not yet arrived at the store. But her goal, we learn later, had been to teach the mynah birds dirty words to scandalize her aunt. Mynah birds can reproduce human speech. So again, disrespectful. And later, to hammer this point home of birds as either playthings or victims, in the restaurant scene I mentioned earlier, which is almost like a play within a play, it's a great scene, an elderly woman, a British ornithologist who just happens to be dining at this restaurant in Bodega Bay, gives the concerned citizens gathered there her expert view that a massed attack by birds of different subspecies is impossible, contrary to the laws of nature. And to support her argument, she says, quote, "Birds are not aggressive creatures. They bring beauty into the world. Mankind, rather, and right there, she's cut off by a waitress calling out an order for fried chicken, right? So you get the point." Now, what she says there about birds not being aggressive is obviously not true. Eagles, condors, owls, these are holy terrors of the skies to many creatures. Even the smaller birds, not classified as birds of prey, can be vicious. But scenes like that made me wonder if this entire film is fundamentally a revenge story. If perhaps Hitchcock, as he grew older and more cynical, had come to share that Joseph Cotten character's point of view, at least to some degree. You know, Orson Welles, who was quite a bit younger than Hitchcock, but arrived in Hollywood at the exact same time in the early 40s, and knew him fairly well, at least as well as one could know Hitchcock. He was a very reserved, fearful man, hidden behind multiple layers of defense. But years later, Welles was asked about Hitchcock, and after offering some praise, mostly for his technical skill, he said, quote, "But there's a certain icy calculation in a lot of Hitch's work that puts me off. He says he doesn't like actors, and sometimes it looks as though he doesn't like people," unquote. Hitchcock once famously classified actors as cattle. But there is, in the birds, a kind of fundamental coldness, a clinical objectivity that, to me, borders on the misanthropic, which is not a criticism, it's just an observation. But this especially occurred to me watching one of those complex optical effect shots that I mentioned, where in the midst of that massive attack on the restaurant, which results in an explosion after a man trying to light a cigarette drops a lit match on a gasoline leak. But rather than stay down with the humans at street level, Hitchcock takes us up into the skies, where we literally get a bird's eye view of all this destruction, as we and the birds calmly watch these suddenly pitiful ex-masters of the universe scurry around this burning landscape like chickens with their heads cut off. Now, The Birds, which in my opinion was Hitchcock's last good film, is certainly not perfect. Tippi Hedren, while not nearly as bad as her detractors seem to think she was, neither does she have the shadings or the screen presence of some of Hitchcock's earlier blondes, like Kim Novak in Vertigo, Ingrid Bergman in Notorious certainly, or even Grace Kelly, who I was never that crazy about. There's also something a little irritating, or at least unsatisfying, about Tippi Hedren's voice. It has a kind of prim, schoolteacherish quality to it. But to be fair, she is given some pretty crappy lines at times. The screenplay is uneven. 2 or 3 scenes, especially one written by Hitchcock himself, to Evan Hunter's dismay, a dialogue between Hedren and Rod Taylor during that birthday party, where Hedren complains about her mother and has to cry, which is a bridge too far. But scenes like that feel ill-conceived and half-hearted. It's as if Hitchcock said, well, we can't have the whole film be bird attacks. Let's throw in some character development, which was never his forte. His great genius was primarily visual. He also had a remarkable sense of pacing. But if you can tolerate the imperfections, it is a film that casts a spell, even today. Certainly unique for its time, and it really paved the way for a number of future blockbusters, especially in the 70s, where nature turns on humans. Probably the best of which was Steven Spielberg's Jaws, which I think owes a lot to The Birds in terms of theme and structure. Which brings me to my ranked list of the top 10 films of Hitchcock's entire career, and I will be telegraphically brief here. Coming in at number 10, I've got Suspicion from 1941. Terrific lead performances by Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine, the latter the only Oscar-winning performance in any of Hitchcock's films. The end is a crashing cop-out, but it's a film that effectively plays on the fear of relationships. At number 9, I've got the aforementioned Shadow of a Doubt from 1943, Hitchcock's favorite of all his films, with an excellent screenplay written mostly by Thornton Wilder. This one's about the darkness lurking behind the facade of small-town America. At number 8, I've got The Wrong Man from 1956, grim, 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 and the only Hitchcock film based on a true story and characters. In this case, a musician, played well by Henry Fonda, who just happens to resemble a hold-up man and whose life is turned upside down by this false charge. Not flawless, but probably Hitchcock's most underrated film. At number 7, I've got The Birds, about which nothing more need be said. At number 6, I've got Rear Window from 1954, which is at the same time really good and a little overrated. It does drag in spots, but great performance as always by Jimmy Stewart. One scene in particular. Watch his facial expression as he watches, through his binoculars, his love interest, played by Grace Kelly, get trapped in the killer's apartment. Phenomenal. And really good supporting work by Raymond Burr as the killer, and Wendell Corey, too, as the disbelieving cop. At number 5, I've got Strangers on a Train from 1951. Excellent portrayal of a psychopath by Robert Walker, who sadly, about 2 months after this film was released, died at the age of 32 from a mixture of drugs and alcohol. The sequence to watch here is his stalking and murder of Farley Granger's wife at an amusement park. It's one of the best sequences in all of Hitchcock. At number 4, I've got North by Northwest from 1959. For pure escapist fun, you really can't beat it. Now, Eva Marie Saint is maybe a little miscast as the quasi-femme fatale, but the pacing, the music, the combination of thrills and comedy, the set pieces, especially the famous crop duster sequence, make this one a true classic. And as I've said before, really the prototype in many ways of the James Bond films soon to follow. At number 3, I've got Psycho from 1960. Groundbreaking, basically flawless direction and musical score, a career-defining performance, much to his later dismay by Tony Perkins, who became typecast. Maybe Martin Balsam's best performance as well. The scene where Balsam continually trips up in unraveling Perkins is terrific. Wonderful sustained tension in this film, much of it due to Bernard Herrmann's score. At number 2, I've got Notorious from 1946. The first 20 minutes are a little slow, but it really revs up nicely once Ingrid Bergman, posing as a Nazi sympathizer, becomes ensconced and then trapped in this seething den of Nazis in Brazil. She, Cary Grant, Claude Rains certainly, and Leopoldine Constantin, who plays Claude Rains' mother despite being only 3 years older than the actor. None of these performances could possibly be surpassed, and the screenplay by Ben Hecht adds a nice kind of hard-boiled film noir touch. It's a great film that could easily have been my number 1, but I had to go with Vertigo from 1958 for my top pick. It's just a little more adventuresome, and you get the sense watching it of a director completely invested in his material. Jimmy Stewart once again fantastic as a man utterly doomed to his romantic obsession Kim Novak is both gorgeous and surprisingly skilled in what amounts to 2 roles, really. She should have been nominated. Phenomenal, a Wagner-esque score by Bernard Herrmann, and probably the most beautiful photography of any of Hitchcock's films, shot on location in and around San Francisco. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. And stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.